They were starting to get content into the communities, into remote communities. And all of a sudden we were having Aboriginal kids speaking with American accents because they were watching Sesame Street and they were watching American programs. And so it was like, how do we actually make sure that we have our own voices heard for our kids? We're telling this Aboriginal story and we've got an Aboriginal director and we've got an Aboriginal writer. But at the end of the day, the IP still sits then with a white company if that's who's producing it. We need to nurture and skill up our First Nations producers and get more of them so that the IP still sits within First Nations hands. If we're telling a community story, there's a process we have to go through to cover our own skins, because we are seeing those people in the supermarket. We're telling a story for our mob, from our mob, in a way that it makes sense to both the people who are telling the story and the people who are listening to the story.
Welcome to We Interrupt This broadcast. I'm so excited to be joined today by CEO of Goolarri Media Enterprises and Ramu Productions, Jodie Bell, whose work includes Warm Props, Yokai, Butabari, and The Rainmakers, and is in production on Little J and Big Cuz Season 5. Welcome to the podcast, Jodie.
Thanks, Loani, and welcome to everyone that's watching and listening to this.
Goolarri Media, you're based up in Broome, Indigenous owned and led, screen production arm in Ramu. Can you give us a picture of what day-to-day that looks like?
We started about 35 years ago. We came about as an Aboriginal corporation, so Broome Aboriginal Media Association, and we were founded by a group of musicians. Around the same time, Jimmy Chai was writing Brand New Day, so his successful play. All these people were kind of in Broome doing all these creative things, but they weren't actually getting a platform to get their work out and get their voices out. At the time, we didn't have TV here in the Kimberley, so we hadn't caught up with the rest of Australia. And the ABC came kind of late 80s, I believe, for the Kimberleys. I was only a child, so I can't remember. And we had ABC radio, but that came from Perth. And so there'd been a bit of a movement happening in First Nations media on the Eastern Coast, in Redfern in particular. First Nations people started having programming on Skid Row radio, and that had led to them actually getting a community radio license. And at the same time, in the pitlands in Central Australia and in Alice Springs, Carmel was kind of forming, and they were sort of talking about how do we get media, how do we use media to elevate the issues of Aboriginal people. And in the pitlands at Ernambella, which is a remote community on the South Australian Northern Territory borders, they had started doing community television. So they were the first community television station that ever kind of popped up in Australia. And it started as a bit of a pirate program, a pirate station run just internally on an internal kind of loop. And that was around people starting to worry because they were starting to get content into the communities, into remote communities. And all of a sudden we were having Aboriginal kids speaking with American accents and things like that because they were watching Sesame Street and they were watching American programs. And so it was like, how do we actually make sure that we have our own voices heard for our kids? And so that's kind of how media started across Australia for First Nations people. So Broome also picked up on that as it was happening, but we were definitely led by our kind of local musicians and artists that were here in Broome. So then they started talking about how do we get a radio license, and that's how we kind of, the corporation got formed. Still to this day, Broome Aboriginal Media Association is our parent organisation that owns our properties. That's a membership-based organisation, so there's members feed into that up to a board of directors who then feed down to Goolarri Media, who became the operational company. And that started because of the ABC. The ABC really helped bring about our license. So at the time, David Hill, who was the managing director of the ABC, got really on board and was helping remote communities have airtime on the ABC networks regionally. And he then also helped people get their own community licenses. So we started out broadcasting 55 minutes a week on the ABC Kimberley in Broome, and that took about 5 years until we got our own license and a 24-hour service. We sort of looked at how do we make sure that we keep up with technological changes. Television came to the Kimberley, commercial stations were coming to the Kimberley in terms of television. So it was how do we plug into that? And so in the late 90s, 2 narrowcast licenses came available through ACMA across Australia, and basically they were put on the open market to bid, and we put a bid in for one and got it. So narrowcast means you just have to have a particular specialty interest group that you broadcast on that license. So we got some space on the bandwidth, and then when in 2012-13 when the analog system got shut down and went to the digital broadcast system, and what were traditionally community television stations in the capital cities all got shut down and basically got forced to go online. Because we were a narrowcast license, we actually didn't get shut down. So we were actually given digital bandwidth. And so still to this day have a broadcast platform here in Broome. That's a television station that we feed content into. So Goolarri got set up as the operational company to manage the day-to-day runnings of the media service. Our focus has always been on how do we support First Nations storytelling, how do we support First Nations artists to tell their stories. Even though we have our own platforms, we don't stick to necessarily to those platforms. We go with whatever the artist wants to platform that the artist wants to work with and see how we can make that work for that person. And to be sustainable in a small town, we've had to branch out into things like theatre. We've branched out into things like events and events management. We've always had musicians as one of our core kind of pillars. And so we do a lot of events where we do performances and professional development for Aboriginal artists, like musical artists, and provide opportunities for them to perform, but help them get out into mainstream as well. At one point, we had some scripts that have been written by local people who wanted to apply to go into some short film initiatives. And because at the time Goolarri had also gone into training, so we were sending our broadcasters to Bachelor College, who used to traditionally do a lot of the First Nations media training. But we were finding, because we used to have them working here with us, they were going to Bachelor and they kind of knew more than what they were getting taught at Bachelor. And then because of the distance of being, 1,000 kilometres from home, having to do 3-week blocks and things like that, people weren't engaging and they were coming home. And so it was like someone had a brainwave, let's become a training organisation. So anyway, 10 years down the track, some people come to us with scripts they'd developed through various programs we'd run, and they're like, how do I make a short film out of this? How do I get this onto a screen? To do that, we had to set up Ramu Productions as a production company that was separate, because Goolarri, as a training institute, can't access sort of film funding through Screen Australia and Screen West and those traditional film ways. So we now have the two companies sit side by side. Goolarri Media is sort of the main company and the community media side. Ramu Productions specialises in how do we take those stories that people are developing, usually through Goolarri kind of talent development programs that we run, and how do we get them onto a screen.
Wow, it's a really big undertaking. I'm curious, how did you fit into that?
I was actually living in Fitzroy Crossing, which is a remote town 4 hours east of Broome. Actually was CEO of a community organisation there, and had got to a point where I was burning out in that job. And also my kids were sort of getting to high school, and I really needed them to get out of a small town where only 4 kids at that time had graduated year 12. And so I was like, okay, I don't like the odds here of my kids being number 5 and 6 type of thing. So I was like, okay, we need to go somewhere a little bit bigger. And at the time, the CEO of Goolarri offered me a job as the business development manager, which is basically writing submissions, working with all the various teams to get funding to make projects happen. We had gotten a great First Nations producer from the East Coast, but then for family reasons and things wanted to go home. The CEO, who really had come from a business background, not so much a media background, was like, well, yeah, producing is just like the business development head of a project. So we'll just merge those two positions together and you can become both. So that's how I produced my first show, which was a 7-minute doco as part of the Deadly Yarns series with the ABC. And so then actually decided I really loved that. We set up Ramu because we found that we couldn't get funding because of those sort of structural barriers around being RTOs and having the broadcast function. So we had to set up a separate company. But then things changed and he actually left, and suddenly I got left with the whole lot. And here we are today, and I'm still managing the whole lot.
It really is a whole lot. So for listeners out there, just to give a very brief example of what a day in the life of Jodie Bell might look like. You and I have spent some time together working on One Props, actually. Yeah. It really changed me, being somewhere where I got really clear insight into how a community not only feeds into the content of the story, but how something is made. I went up to Broome and we did a writer's room up there. Jodie picked me up for the writer's room. And even before that, she'd probably done 3 or 4 other pickups for different members of the community who needed her help. We get into the writer's room. There was an event being put on outside. So there were moments where Jodie would be stepping in and out of the writer's room to serve that, to take other phone calls. None of that really felt like an interruption. It really felt like all of these pieces were being sort of merged into that development process and then through production. So what I walked away with was a real sense that the storytelling, the community, the production, the events, maybe on paper would sound like chaos, but it works. Like it really works. Everybody's got each other's back and you're doing the work that needs to be done and the work is better for it. It's a lot to hold though, Jodie. How do you manage all of that?
At the core of my ethos is around, I just want to be that conduit to help First Nation storytelling, and that's what Goolarri is about. We're telling a story for our mob, from our mob, in a way that it makes sense to both the people who are telling the story and the people who are listening to the story. And, if that story becomes much bigger to a non-Aboriginal audience, that's great, because then we're hopefully changing perspectives, we're changing people's ideas around what an Aboriginal person is, or how an Aboriginal family works, or how Aboriginal culture is portrayed. So for me, it's all about the storytelling. And I love being able to help an emerging storyteller be able to get that first step and go forward. And that's what drives me, is making sure and helping that process happen. During warm props, I reckon I was like having 4 hours sleep a night. And I did accidentally pre-book a holiday that left me missing the last day of shoot. Much to SBS's.
I forgot about that.
And I'm kind of like, how do I say I'm going on a family holiday that's already pre-booked because I just got the dates wrong?
Did book a holiday that conflicted with production dates, but I'm gonna advocate for you here for a moment. It wasn't just born out of a bad scheduling decision. It wasn't that you had accidentally double booked. It just speaks to everything that you're managing. It really spoke to me about how the process is so important as well, and realizing that we're dealing with people. So it's not on me to say, well, this is the schedule that I would like you to hold to. If there's a version that we can make work, which is what we did, right? We found a solution. And that kept it very human-centered and very process-driven versus just thinking about output, money, schedule, timeline.
That was a classic example, because, warm props, really, we had location pressures in that story that we had to meet that was on a certain day. Like there was a scene that we needed a really high tide during the day that we could shoot, or 2 days that we could shoot on. And so, that happens like once a month. And so it wasn't just a matter of being able to push the schedule out 2 or 3 days. If we had to move it, we had to move it like a whole month. We had to be in production by a certain date for SBS. We just have to make it all work, because we were also up against those logistics.
And the rainy season, I learned a lot about rain. Didn't know. Had no idea.
I know. It's really weird, because we live in a cyclone-prone area. So, even though, the last direct cyclone that hit Broome happened in 2000, so 26 years ago, but at the time it was a category 5 and did do a bit of damage, so understandably people are wary of it. But the minute you want to shoot sort of anywhere from late November through to April, your insurances are doubling, just because that's technically the cyclone season. And so those are the things you've got to think about. But when you're trying to add in all those other logistics, plus remote shooting, trying to crew and cast in a remote area where accommodation is expensive, you've got to fly people. 25% of our budget went on travel. Most of our contingency went on travel.
I remember.
We were very, very lucky in that Screen West actually gave us a really good production budget, because they could see the benefit to the West Australian creatives that were in the project.
What's your experience of productions coming in to Broome? Are you finding that there's just not an awareness of all of those constraints?
It's not till they get here and they realise, so there's actually only 50 hire cars in the whole town, and we're waiting to shoot in the middle of June, which is the middle of the race season, which is when all the tourists are here, so there's no accommodation, and all the hire cars are already booked, and there's not enough office space up here that's free for us, so we're having to put production offices scattered all over town, because we can only get some rooms here and some rooms there. And I think it's not going to be that hard until they actually get here and they start crunching the numbers and they realise, actually, It's a lot harder than what we thought, and it's a lot more expensive than what we thought. There's no public transport in town. You're bringing in a whole crew, and so you have to actually move them around, and so all of a sudden you've got 30 people you have to move from location to location, and they can't all just jump on one bus because they all need at different times. And that does get a bit of a logistical nightmare.
That can seem like there's a whole bunch of limitations around shooting up in Broome or shooting regionally. What do you think the benefits are?
We've learned to actually shoot like a guerrilla crew. You have your head of department's the only person in the department. Everyone multitask. And I've done shows where I've had to run around and get the sandwiches for the catering, and same time I'm getting a location agreement signed while I'm doing that. It's saving you a crew member that is going to cost you double their price than just their fee, because you're housing them, having to get them around, all that sort of stuff. But the shooting in Broome is beautiful. We have the most amazing exteriors that you don't get anywhere else in Australia. And we literally have 200 days of just blue skies. So you're not having to worry about clouds coming over today, because that just doesn't happen here. So you're not having to match skies and that sort of thing. And it's just such a creative place to be in. Like, Broome's just got this amazing sort of underbelly of creativity through so many different platforms and art forms here, and so many different nations and multicultural, not just First Nations, but lots of different other people. We have circus here, we have theatre, we have music, we have film, painters and visual artists and dancers, like Marangeku's based here, who's one of the leading First Nations dance companies in Australia. They're based in Broome.
The lively group of creatives that exist in Broome was such a delightful surprise. There's this writers catch up, and it was probably more populated than any writers group that I'd ever participated in.
The writers group program's one about development programs that we run, and we've been running that since 2013. We've had this core group of First Nations writers, and despite the fact that they're getting works up and they're getting recognised as writers, they still come back and help newer people in the group. Scripts like Warm Props, a lot of those scripts went through that writers group. We're going to read you the script so we can see what you guys all think about it. Is this working for you? Does this change work? And a lot of the productions that we do out of Broome that have come from that writers group have started where scripts have been kind of workshopped in that informal way in the group. It's a different process than probably what a normal writer would go through when they're developing their script.
I remember meeting somebody who was training up in sound, and he was so passionate and showing me all these tools, which I didn't understand. I've got no technical ability whatsoever. But what I found so captivating was his passion for finding his specialty skill. So you're investing time and resources into training that talent. Are you finding that investment keeps them in Broome, keeps them in community, or even if they're going away, are you finding that they're coming back home because of that foundational investment?
Yeah, I think we are definitely, we understand they need to go and find their wings. We've had people that have come from us, gone to afters, but then they've come back to work for us. We've had people that have gone, but they're still working, say, over in Sydney or whatever. Even Kelrick Martin, who's head of Indigenous at ABC, started out as a broadcaster here at Goolarri. But, they also always acknowledge that they started with us. And so that's always been something that we've been really proud of. We're very staunch with Screen West that, if you're a First Nations West Australian, you're a First Nations West Australian no matter where you're currently living. And so that needs to be kind of recognized in the funding system around creatives. Screen West has been really good about that. And it's really because, we're trying to develop up a mob of creatives.
Yeah, I guess that collaboration or the consultation that you've got with your screen agency that feels quite responsive to the needs of Goolarri and Ramu. What do you need out of the wider industry to continue to thrive?
I think part of it is that recognition that we can do it from here. We don't need to be in Sydney or Melbourne. Trust us enough to partner with us to do some of those bigger projects. I know there's like a move towards a lot of the streamers, and even the commissioners now are like wanting to have those really big, large-scale production companies because they're trusted companies. They can manage the money. They get the project out the door at the end. It'd be great to have those companies start to talk to us and say, let's actually partner, not we want to take your stories and we'll produce it how we want to produce it, but let's collaboratively do it together so that we can become one of those trusted companies. We do a lot of short form stuff. We're trying to get into long form stuff. We've got long form scripts and ready to go and funding in place for some things, but still getting over that last hurdle is we don't really know your track record. Yes, you can pull off a 10 short, but we're talking, a 6 by 1 hour show. Where's your track record on that? And so, but how do we get into that? Because the minute you start partnering up with a big company all they're wanting is to make sure that they can run it themselves out of there. And so it's like, but we need to have those skills because we want to be able to do it ourselves. We need to be in charge of telling our own story.
Authenticity and accountability get thrown around in our industry so often and carelessly.
Despite the whole, society and the way First Nations people are getting treated around the world at the moment, and people of colour are getting treated around the world at the moment, and the very right-wing leaning way the world seems to be leaning at the moment, which is horrific. But there's still an appetite to actually see First Nation stories on screen and listen to First Nation stories, and people like Warwick and Rachel and Darren Dale, and they've really blazed this trail for a number of years for the rest of us, where ABC is wanting to have First Nations television series on screen. SBS is wanting to have First Nations series on screen. NITV is full of First Nations content, obviously. Despite all that political leaning that's happening out in the world, there is a big appetite still to see our stories. So we need to make sure that those stories are getting out there correctly and right, and that we ultimately end up own that IP of those stories. And so we need to take advantage of that. And I think those big production companies need to see that they can have a role to play in that if they want to do it together rather than be the lord over us.
Something like Goolarri and Ramu that is accountable to community so directly. What does that feel like when you're in the supermarket and ownership of the organisation is right there in front of your face? You're immersed in it. What does that feel like when the people that you're actually accountable to are the people that are your neighbours? They're your friends, they're your relatives.
And they don't hold back telling you if they're not happy about something. And so that's something we've always got to be very mindful of. I know it was something that we came up within Warm Props is like, we're trying to tell a Broome story about Broome issues, and people can see themselves. Like we know when people are going to look at it, they'll see themselves in those characters. We need to make sure that we're actually telling that story right. And so we can't be at the whim of a broadcaster or someone who's like, oh, but I think maybe you should add this to the arc to make it more interesting. It's like, yeah, but that person's going to know that didn't happen and we're going to get yelled at in the supermarket. And so we always have to tread that really lightly. And so I think we're always up against that when we're trying to tell stories, because writers do write from their lived experience. They write from what they know. And when you're living in a small town, everyone knows what you know. Everyone knows everyone else's business and knows what the story is that you're telling. And so you do have to be careful to make sure that it is authentic. And if it is going away too much from that authenticity, you have that discussion with the community and you have that discussion with people so they can understand why that happens and why that has to happen sometimes, With Brand New Day of the Film, for example, they did go through a huge community consultation process so people could understand that what you see in the stage show was not necessarily how it's going to roll directly onto the screen. But there's reasons, and you do it as authentically as you can and as collaborative as you can. And that becomes hard when partnering with a non-First Nations company who doesn't understand that, because all they're seeing is you've got this X time and you need to get this show on the screen by then. And I think, and that's where we've had to be really mindful of when we partner up with other companies, as to who those companies are, and that they understand that this is our process, that if we're telling a community story, there's a process we have to go through to cover our own skins to a certain extent, because we are seeing those people in the supermarket, they are our family. We sit and have a cup of tea with them on the weekend, but we want to be able to also be growled for the right things.
And the other side of it is all the benefits of being that responsive to community, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's awesome. The night that Warm Props dropped onto SBS, we had a community screening here at Goolarri as well for the community. And it was just so great seeing everyone laugh when they were supposed to laugh, everyone understanding the Broome talk in it. It's great that, people watched it online and watched it on SBS and stuff. But for us, the fact that the community watched it and, we got great feedback from the community was just really good to know that First Nation stories don't always have to be a recount of our horrific history. They can actually be fun, lighthearted stories of just a moment in time, like Warm Props was a moment in time for a girl who's traumatized by her past but is trying to look into her future. And the situation she found herself in and the comedy we could pull out of that.
We'll link it in the show notes because it's such a fun series, but it also will give you the perfect reflection of so many things that Jodie's spoken about today in terms of productions breezing in and thinking they know what's what to shoot up in Broome.
So Jub Claire created the concept for Warm Props and created the story. and she was series director and writer on the project. But we did also have another writer director, Kimberly Benjamin, who's another Broome girl, who's a bit more emerging than Jub, and so we brought her in to help upskill her as well and get her some credits up.
Great example of what you were saying earlier about building up talent and building up community and that loyalty to the community. Jub's a successful writer director now, choosing to shoot up in Broome, tell a story that's specific to the Kimberley, specific to community up there. Perfect example of what you were saying about investing in talent, and they'll stay loyal.
I think also why it's important for Ramu to exist is that still the way this industry is structured is that the IP at the end of the day still sits with the producers. And so even though you can say, yep, we're telling this Aboriginal story and we've got an Aboriginal director and we've got an Aboriginal writer, but at the end of the day, the IP still sits then with a white company if that's who's producing it. And so that's why it's so important that we need to nurture and skill up our First Nations producers and get more of them so that the IP still sits within First Nations hands. You know what I mean?
When the industry is at large demanding that smaller to mid-tier companies partner with those big companies at the top of our sector, how are you managing that negotiation when it comes to rights?
A lot of companies still feel like they're doing the right thing by having, say, a First Nations writer or a First Nations director. So why do all of a sudden do we need to have a First Nations producer in there as well, you know? And I've got to say, people like Job and other people who are starting to carry some weight with their writing are then saying, well, actually, I want to have a First Nations production company in here. So yes, you can look at my script, but I'll only do it if we're partnering with a First Nations company as well. And so that's been really good. Still, a lot of companies don't see the need to do that because they think, because technically they are ticking the boxes, right? I think that's probably where our next step needs to be in terms of things like ISIP rights and how do we manage those, and a next iteration of the protocols and things like that needs to start thinking about, well, how do we actually ensure that the IP stays within the community as well.
For the foreseeable future, what does the growth of Goolarri and Ramu look like, and how do you imagine you keep it sustainable?
We have a number of projects in development and that are close to, like a couple that are close, long form projects that are close to being funded, which I think is going to really boost up from the Ramu side of stuff. On the community media side, it's always a struggle. There's very little funding available to run community media in Australia in the First Nations space. There's been the same amount in a bucket of money for like 15, 20 years now, but more communities are coming online with their own platforms and stuff who want a slice of that pie. So there's been a lot of work done at a political level in the community media, the First Nations community media space, to try and increase that funding, because we're all running on the smell of an oily rag type of thing. And so we're always having to juggle, how do we finance everything, which is how Ramu to a certain extent even came into existence as well, because it's like there's an avenue where potentially down the track we might make some money that can then go back into the other side. Our in-house production crew, one week they might be working on warm props, but then the next week they're doing a video for a mining company on how to employ Aboriginal people, or they're doing an induction video for the local shire or something like that. So we do corporate jobs which kind of pay the bills and that bread and butter type of stuff, or we're doing an ad about health for Indigenous people or something, So it's always that constant round, just constantly chasing the dollar to get projects into that pay the bills, so that you can do some more of these creative stuff. You can put money into development of stories and that sort of thing. One day hopefully that nut might crack a little bit. We're working on Little J Big Cuz now. I think that's a prime project that could speak to a lot more remote based work than it currently does. Animation is something that can be done in your house. If you've got a computer and you've got good Wi-Fi access and you've got the skills, you can be animating, you know what I mean? And so my discussions with the animation teams is, how do we start doing, like, even if it's just one person sitting on a community doing, one scene or something, how can we grow that, and how can we build that on that to create more opportunities on country for people that are living in community to be part of these projects, even if we're starting from the beginning, get them into training, knowing that in 2 or 3 years' time, when we might be on series 7 by then, hopefully, yay. But we're doing that, and that we can say we've got an animator sitting in Balgo or sitting, somewhere out bush, that's hooking up on their computer and plugging into the system, into the animator studio in Melbourne or Hobart or wherever the animation studio is sitting, And, they're feeding into that process a little bit, and they're getting paid to do that.
What strikes me about what you are saying in terms of what a measure of success is, it is that community impact. It is that the media infrastructure that you've got built up through Goolarri, through productions that you're making through Ramu, they're like connective tissue within a community, which to me is the screaming success of Goolarri and Ramu. And we're not talking about media as output. We're not talking about what's necessarily on screen or in our ears. We're talking about it being an essential service to the livelihood of a community.
And we always say that. We basically say that Goolarri is an essential service and should be treated as such. We're providing information, we're providing access, we're providing pathways for people that are essential. We all know WA is a mining state. This state is built on the riches of mining. A lot of people don't survive it and need to get out of it. So how do we help people realize that being in the creative industries in whatever way, shape or form actually can be a career, and you can do it from home, and you can be satisfied, and you can still pay the rent and pay your power and buy your food and send your kids to school and all that stuff by being a creative. And I think across the board, probably the whole country, but especially here in WA, I think the creative industries is probably not yet recognised, but it's not seen as a serious employment option. It could actually be a really significant workforce if people looked at it properly and rolled it out properly and supported it properly.
What do you think other organisations can learn from that community media and production arm model?
So I reckon it's around not having that classical view of how a production works and the roles that people play in a production. I know people need to stay in their own lane and that sort of stuff, but there are ways of making it work and making it work better and more smoothly when sometimes maybe those lanes are a little bit blurred. When you're running a community media organisation, you learn how to blur those lanes because people multitask. You're not just a cameraman or you're not just a soundy, but you also know how to do the lights and you also know how to, do the catering. I think it gives you a better perspective, and it also gives you a better appreciation of when you do finally get to a project where you might have a full crew, you actually then appreciate your full crew. You never forget where you came from. And I'm definitely not advocating for we can do it on less, because we can't. And it's great when you have all those different roles that you have where you can have them filled. But I think when you've come from where you haven't been able to have that, you then appreciate when you do have all that. That just makes for a much smoother production. And, the best sets are when people are happy.
Is there anything that anybody listening to this podcast can do to help support or advocate for more money to flow up to areas like Broome?
Oh, definitely. I mean, you can practically tell your local politicians to support community media. So there is an Indigenous media program that's funded through the government, which is what, part funds places like Goolarri and, Karma and all those other community media organisations. On the ground in your towns and your cities, learn who the First Nations community radio stations are, listen to them, support them, show that they got listeners. Radio, a lot of people try to say that radio is dying, but it's not. A lot of people still listen to radio. But, go and listen to community radio stations. They're so much more entertaining than the mainstream kind of commercial stations, and not quite as controversial and, much more inclusive of everybody. So obviously we target a First Nations audience, but it's really about community and where First Nations people sit in the communities. And so, with the exception of, I think, Adelaide and Hobart, there is an First Nations radio station in all capital cities of Australia. And most regional centres now have a First Nations radio station that you can listen to and be a part of and support through just the events they have, because we all kind of are running fundraising events or events to get our stories out there, to get our station out there. So support those sort of things. Whether you can volunteer to do a program or volunteer to help with some admin. There's never enough volunteers around. That's what people can practically do on the ground today. It might seem like them to be a small impact, but I think if we're all doing it, it becomes a bigger movement,
It's excellent practical advice for our listeners to tune in. Go onto the Goolarri and Ramu websites, look at the work that you're doing, and we'll add it to the show notes so you've got no excuse. Now, Jodie, we ask all our guests to end every one of our deep dives, what's their big idea to help shape the future of the Australian screen industry?
From a First Nations perspective, NITV is our platform that sits in SBS, but has nowhere near the budget of, say, mainstream SBS or ABC commissioning. At the moment, they're very hamstrung by a very, very small budget that hasn't grown very much at all. And that's been over 10 years now. And I think that needs to be looked at. And if we're really serious about getting and supporting First Nations storytellers, that's probably the first platform we should be supporting and getting out there. When we're talking funding, how do we get NITV better funded? Watch NITV, because, you know, the ratings still matter for government. They want to know that people are actually watching their public broadcasters, because they're getting pressures to why do we keep funding public broadcasters? That they're not there to make money. They're not supposed to make money. They're supposed to be a public broadcast, which means they have to be government funded. So, and they shouldn't have to justify their existence every budget cycle to a government. You know, so it helps when they can show numbers that people are watching those stations. So watch those stations. And, you know, and I'm terrible about it too. You know, you jump on your television, you got so many choices now with all the streamers and all that sort of stuff. But we can't afford to lose the public broadcasters.
Yeah, I love that, and making NITV that real destination for First Nations content. This has been such a great way for us to catch up when we don't often get that opportunity. Yes. But also just it's such a great grounding reminder of like all the work that Goolarri and Ramu do, everything that you do to keep community and culture alive. Thank you for everything that you do in that regard, and for today's conversation. I've loved it.
No worries. Thank you so much, Loani. I've loved having a chat with you.
We Interrupt This broadcast is recorded on the unceded lands of the
Gadigal people of the Eora Nation,
the Turrbal and Yagara people,
the Yugambeh language people, and the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and we acknowledge them as the traditional custodians and first storytellers of these regions.
Always was, always will be.